Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Melissa Pineda, and today I will be discussing the book He Leadeth Me by Father Walter Ciszek. I actually learned about this book on the app Hello. I don't know if anyone here listens to it or has heard of it. It's an American Catholic app, and there was first some priests on the app were talking about it, and then I got even more interested when they started this Lent 40 challenge, and this is basically where they walk through the book, essentially reading excerpts from it and then relating it to Lent and the Lenten season and to Jesus. And it was very interesting, but that wasn't enough for me to just get these little blurbs on the app. So I was really curious and wanted to read it myself. So here we are. So Father Walter Ciszek was born in 1904 in America to Polish immigrants, and he died in 1984. And he joined the Jesuits in 1928. And the very next year, there was a call from Pope Pius the 11th, and he was calling on seminarians to enter a new Russian center in Rome to prepare priests for work in Russia. And he felt like it was a direct call from God to do this. He felt like this is what he needed to do. So he joined, and he was eager to go serve in Russia. And it's his story. He's written a few books, and this one book was about the faith that he held. A lot of people, he said, when he returned in the 60s to the United States after spending 23 years in either prison or a forced labor camp in Siberia, he was asked, how? How did you survive this? How could anyone survive this? He went through torture. He went through near starvation, the trials and tribulations that this priest went through. It's incredible that he did survive, and his only response always was faith. Faith was his answer. And he goes into it more, of course, and he talks in detail about his experience there. But truly remarkable book. Whether you're Catholic, Christian, or not, it is a remarkable read to know how anyone survived in such a situation. It was a remarkable man. So let's dive in. I'm going to talk to you about some of my things I found most interesting in the book, and then if you feel as though this interests you, then I encourage you to pick up a copy. I highly recommend this book. So let's begin. Father Ciszek isn't necessarily someone that people thought would become a priest. He didn't think he'd become a priest, I don't think, initially. He was a kid that got into a lot of trouble. When he was young, he was a little physical. He challenged himself. He decided, when he did decide to become a priest, he would intentionally prepare himself for tough situations. He was constantly pushing the limits of what he could do. And he would do things like give up meat for a year, or like put himself through these personal challenges. Honestly, it reminds me of Mark Wahlberg, to be honest. He's also on the Hello app, and he's a very interesting guy. Just kind of pushing yourself where you can go, how far you can go. And he talks about this in his book, and says that a lot of it had to do with pride, you know, almost as though he could withstand something easier than his fellow priests. And at the time, he didn't see it like that, of course, but later he did. I mean, he had a lot of time to think and reflect in the Russian prisons and in the Siberian work camps. So it's crazy. So basically, Father Walter Ciszek was sent. He thought he was going into Russia, but what had happened is there was no way to send him there. The communist regime was very hostile to the Catholic Church, to the Vatican, so he instead was sent to work at a mission in Poland, Alberton, Poland. And then the war broke out in 1939, and Poland was invaded, and in all like the chaos, there was an opportunity for him to flee to Russia with some other people that were in the camp, and he did. And shortly after that, I mean, at first he thought, this is great, this is a blessing in disguise, I can minister in Russia the way I had intended. And then he was arrested as a Vatican spy, and he was put into solitary confinement. And for the first year, he was basically interrogated often, but sometimes there would be periods, it was all like psychological torture. You know, it was, first of all, there was no sounds at all in this prison. Even the guards would wear slippers, so it would disguise their footsteps. And then all of a sudden the food would appear and then they would be gone and no one would ever talk to him. And he wasn't allowed to lay down or sit on the bed unless it was time to sleep. Otherwise, he had to stand up. So he was leaning against a wall, pacing in the small room, and he was interrogated. Sometimes, you know, it was the good cop, sometimes it was the bad cop, sometimes it was in between. He was constantly told that he was going to be shot, that he would be killed. It was probably, I think it was about a year, and he finally confessed to something that he didn't do, that he wasn't a Vatican spy. But it was difficult for him to hold out, and he thought, okay, if I confess, then, you know, that'll be it. Like, that it'll get easier, you know. And unfortunately it didn't, and they still kept him in solitary confinement. And then he lost his faith a bit. He felt like it wavered. He felt like he had failed as well, that he wasn't strong enough. He also felt like in his weakest moment, God would come and give him those words, would give him that grace, and would help him to know what to say. And he didn't feel that. He didn't feel the Lord's presence when he needed him the most. He thought he thought he had been abandoned, which wasn't the case, but that is what he felt at the time. Father Ciszek talks about how there were some moments where he lost all hope. He was surrounded by darkness and there was no way out. And he said that he lost absolutely all hope, all faith, everything, and he even contemplated suicide at some points, which he never foresaw himself ever doing. And he said that he realized at that point that there was only one thing to do. And he said that in that moment, he can't explain it in any other way apart from the fact that he had a conversion experience. And he knew what he had to do. He had to entirely abandon himself to the will of the Father and live from now on in this spirit of self-abandonment to God. And he did. And so basically what happened is, like, he had admitted to being a Vatican spy. He signed some papers that they wanted him to sign, and that's when he felt completely like he just wasn't worth anything. Like, how could he abandon his faith? He didn't feel God. How could he do that, right? How could he do this? And complete despair. And when he had this conversion experience, all of a sudden things just changed completely. And he said that even the interrogator could see this change in him. So he had been interrogated for a year. He finally signed the papers. He thought it would be over. But it wasn't over. They continued to interrogate him for a number of years. I think he was there for 5 years altogether before being sentenced to 15 years of hard labor in a Siberian work camp and then being sent there. But at this point, now the interrogator would come back and would say things like, okay, well, you know what, we have a mission for you. We want you to go and basically be like a spy for them at the Vatican. And he was like, yeah, sure, no problem. And the interrogator was like, oh, okay. And like anything they wanted him to do, he would just say, yeah, okay, sure. Like that was him now. He was just like gonna be, yeah, okay, sure, yeah, I'll do, yeah, whatever you want, yep. Because he knew that he had abandoned himself to God's will, like the idea of complete surrender. God will take care of him. Whatever is coming his way, it is from God. God will help him. And he felt this. He completely surrendered, and it gave him absolute peace. And so this is kind of how things went for a number of years with the interrogators there in the prison in solitary confinement. Father Ciszek wasn't scared anymore. He didn't have any fear. So when the interrogator finally asked him to sign something else, saying, like, let's proceed with this plan of you being a Vatican spy, like an actual spy, but the reverse now at the Vatican, not for what he was actually charged with for being a Vatican spy. Now they want him to be a communist spy for Russia at the Vatican. And but when they asked him to sign something, he just said no. And the interrogator was like, well, you're going to get shot then. And he was like, okay. And it just, like, he wasn't scared anymore. And so they let him out of the room, and he didn't know where he was going. Like, could have been to a firing squad, but it wasn't. But it didn't matter. He wasn't going to like play their games anymore in that sense. He wasn't going to sign anything else. He just had that courage. He didn't even have to think. It was just like a knee-jerk reaction, like, no, I'm not going to do that. So they sent Father Walter Ciszek on a train. They didn't send him to a firing squad like they had told him they would, but he instead was put on a train and sent to Siberia, and he was in a labor camp from that point on for almost 15 years. And because he was a political prisoner and he was regarded as like the worst of the worst, not like the murderers, but like worse than that. But they gave him the worst jobs. They, like the very first day he was there, he had to shovel some, I don't know if it was coal or rocks or something, but basically there was a conveyor belt he was explaining, and he had to just keep shoveling, and it was freezing, like it was freezing in Siberia, and they barely had enough clothes, barely had enough food, and if he didn't keep shoveling, he would be buried by whatever was coming his way. And he couldn't, like, within a couple minutes, he was already frozen, like muscle-wise, not just from the cold, but from the pain, and somehow he just kept on going. And they worked them for, I don't know, like 15 hours a day. They barely slept. And the next morning, he said every like fiber of his being was almost like paralyzed. Like that's how much pain he was in. Like he had been in solitary confinement for 5 years. There wasn't much physical exercise or anything during those 5 years. He was not well prepared for this at all. Not that anyone could be. But so he suffered greatly, but he continued. Also, he was there with murderers, like people that they had their own way of doing things. Like he saw men beaten to death. Some of those men, the men that were doing the assaults, would just take what they wanted. You know, if they wanted his extra food or any food, if they wanted his clothes, they would just take it. So that's what he experienced for his time there. Father Ciszek also talks about how there were a number of priests in every camp. He was moved around to different camps throughout his time in Siberia, and he encountered different priests, and they were always very welcoming, of course, happy to have him. And they had already established a lot of the contacts needed to have secret masses at these camps. So there are people outside the community, out in the communities, but outside the prison, and they would smuggle things in for them, whether it be bread for the mass or wine. So those things took place. And he said, of course, like such friendship was a joy in itself. But it also meant a chance to go to confession, because that is something that he had not had the privilege or ability to do for a very long time. And he talks about human failings throughout this book, his own. He talks about the people that he's encountered, and he talks about the failings in the priests as well that he encountered. And he said, you know, not all of them are perfect. I mean, no human is. But he said there were even informers among the priests, and they sometimes knew it because trusted prisoners who worked in the offices would tell them of the encounters they'd see. So like some of the priests would be spying on other people within the camp, and sometimes those priests would tell them privately that they had been pressured into cooperation. They would beg for their forgiveness. So Father Ciszek and some of the other priests would hear the confessions of those priests that were informants and spies, essentially, and they shared in their masses, and they were part of, like, that Father Ciszek wouldn't exclude them from anything. And he said, and we could not bring ourselves to turn anyone away from the grace to be gained in the sacraments or in listening to the word of God. We all had our failings. Each of us knew only too well how much we depended upon God and on his grace. He also talked about how there were a number of different types of religious leaders in these camps. So, for instance, there were a number of Baptist ministers in these camps. And he said, but they wouldn't have anything to do with them, with the Catholic priests. And he said that most of them, in fact, were fiercely anti-Catholic and at times openly antagonistic and hostile. And that really shocked him. It really hurt him, he said too. He said he was saddened and puzzled at their attitude toward other believers, especially in those circumstances. Like you're in a hard labor camp in Siberia, sentenced for, you know, decades, and you're on your own and you're among other believers of Christ, but you're not the right kind of believer. So he was shocked, by that. It was obviously very sad, but he said one could not help but admire their dedication and the Christian witness they gave to their beliefs. Father Ciszek talks about the struggle every day of having faith and keeping faith, and he speaks to us in this book. He speaks to people in general in this book, and he says that he understands that it's difficult. It's difficult to be able to accept the will of God when you don't understand it, especially when everyday situations and circumstances demand our attention. It's hard when you're in the middle of your own personal trial or tribulation, you're in pain, to see through that, to see past that. And he says that it's through daily prayer. That's the only way to do it. It's like daily acceptance, daily prayer. And he said that through the anguish of Lubyanka, the prison he was in, through the sufferings and adversities of the prison camps, my inner struggle of soul never ceased. His own inner struggle of soul never ceased. He said, no matter how close to God the soul felt, how blessed it was by an awareness of his presence on occasion, the realities of life were always at hand, always demanding recognition. So he talks about it just being a choice every day, to have faith, but that only happens with daily prayer as well. He said that that's what he had to do. Father Ciszek talks about free will a lot in this book. He talks about the fact that the only absolute freedom we have resides in a man's free will, that they can take away everything else. They can take away your very freedom, but they can't take away your free will, your ability to choose how you'll respond to something, how you'll react to something in any given circumstance or situation. Can't take away how you think, what you believe, even though they take everything else away. So he says that freedom was given us by our Creator so that we may choose freely to love and serve him. And he says, only to man and the angels has he given the power of freely choosing to love and serve him. He has made us a little less than the angels, has given us intellect and free will, and that is the hallmark of man, at once his crown and glory, his most precious gift, his most terrifying responsibility. Only man can freely choose not to serve his Creator. It is in choosing to serve God, to do his will, that man achieves his highest and fullest freedom. And he says that every day, every new hour of every day, and every circumstance and situation, every new act is an opportunity to exercise and grow in this freedom. And he talks about what's required for growth. He says that you need an attitude of acceptance and openness to the will of God rather than some planned approach or calculated method. So he talks about his daily struggle, and what he, almost like the secret of survival, and the secret of having faith. It's not a secret. It's like you just have to have it. You have to believe. You have to pray. You have to choose. You have to choose every day, and you have that free will and that ability to do so. Father Ciszek talks about how men in prison weren't treated like men anymore. They were just treated like a thing, or an animal, really, and not an individual. And he was just another number. And he said that this shattered some men. Some men just kind of died within, just being there. Some men never made it out alive of the prison camps, of course, and others made it out, but they just, weren't, they were like broken after that. Absolutely. And Father Ciszek says that the body can be confined, but nothing can destroy the deepest freedom in man, the freedom of the soul and the freedom of mind and will. So again, going back to the idea of they can take everything away from you, but they can't take away things like your ability to choose how you'll respond to a situation. So he says, even in prison, a man retains his free will, his freedom of choice. Even in prison, a man can choose to do good or evil, to fight for survival or to despair, to serve God and others, or to turn inward and become selfish. Free will remains, and so freedom remains. For freedom is simply defined as the state of being free, not coerced by necessity or fate or circumstances in one's choices or actions. And he's saying that freedom is absolute, and yet freedom itself is not an absolute, as many today would have us believe. So one morning, Father Ciszek was told that he was going to be released. He was told that in 10 days he was going to be released, that some new regulation had come into play, and that he could get 3 months less off his prison sentence and be released 3 months early. So he ended up serving 14 years and 9 months instead of the full 15 years. And he was told that when he was released, he had to go straight to the police station in Norilsk in Russia. So, I mean, he obviously had a greater degree of freedom now in terms of the fact that he was free to go, but like he was told where to go. But in any event, he was so happy. He thought that this was finally it. He was going to at last begin again what he had dreamed of doing, you know, way back when, those, well, 20 years, because almost 15 years in the prison camp, 5 years in solitary confinement. All he wanted to do was be a priest, minister to people in Russia. And so he was finally going to get that opportunity. And it was amazing. He got to Norilsk. He went straight to two priests that had previously been incarcerated as well in the prison camp. They were released earlier than him. And he went straight to them, and he joined the congregation. They already had quite a big following. A lot of people came to them, and they would perform mass, and he joined them, and he said it was just beautiful. And he said that there were so many people that came to him, and he was able to act as a priest. And he said that he often marveled at the way that these people had clung to the faith in this professedly atheistic country. And he speaks of, like, some of these people, like, that's all they knew. They only knew communism. They only knew this hostility toward the Catholic Church. And yet, here they were, many of them willing to risk prison, willing to risk who knows what from the government to practice their faith. And yeah, he just found this absolutely amazing. Father Ciszek talks about how the churches that still stand or had not been closed at that time were generally crowded, and not just with members of like old people in the community, but with a lot of young people as well. He said some of them came to the churches out of curiosity. Others came because they weren't supposed to. Just like young people everywhere, they wanted to show their independence, he said. Others came with a vague desire to rediscover an ethnic or cultural link with old traditions, something, you know, for instance, that their grandparents would have talked to them about. Many of them are still searching for something. They were searching for something even they didn't fully understand and couldn't express. He talks about how, like, they came, you know, he was so surprised that they came. And so the faith in God's providence remains strong and continues to grow. Baptisms continue, and even the children of some Communist Party officials were baptized in secret at that time, which is just, yeah, it's pretty crazy that he experienced that, and just again talks about how courageous some of these people were, because they knew what they were facing and what could have happened to them if they were caught. He talks about how also knowing how little of grace is accepted and realized in our own personal lives, so we can imagine how much of his grace is spurned or rejected by those around us, like even people that believe in God. I mean, everyone sins. And he's saying that, like, in this way, we come to understand why there exists so much evil in the world, so much sin, so much violence, war, hatred, immorality, persecution of religion, and denial of God himself in the world today. These things must follow so long as men refuse to accept God's grace and do his will. So, I mean, he talks a lot about questions that all of us kind of ask too, you know, why evil exists in the world. And yeah, he talks about all of it. Like, this book is just very fascinating. His story alone is just a fascinating one. The kind of man, like the fact that he was able to I don't know, just retain his faith, but also just be so selfless with his life and constantly just want to help others around him. So yeah, remarkable is the only word I can think of, to be quite honest. But so he ends up getting called into a police station in Norilsk, and they told him that his time was up. He talks about how Easter and the Easter ceremony in Norilsk was the highlight of his time there, but was also the cause of his leaving. So he basically didn't sleep from Good Friday until the end of end of day Sunday, and he gave like 3 masses a day. He blessed food, he baptized people, he heard confessions, and it was beautiful. But then basically, like, the very next day he was called into the police station and told that his time there was up. He was done, he was leaving, and he just couldn't believe it. You know, he thought, like, all this time I spent in prison, everything I've gone through was for now, like, was for this period. I'm finally doing what I'm supposed to do. I don't understand why I'm being told to leave. And he said he had a really hard time accepting it. He kept repeating to himself, I will be done. Doing the will of the Father is not always an easy task. And he talks a lot about humility and how he struggled with it and how we all do. And he says that it's natural to resent humiliation. We recoil from humiliating experiences because they are an affront to the dignity of our persons. But he says that humility is nothing more or less than knowing our place before God. And that's a hard one. It's a hard one. And he says that the more people struggle with being humble, like, the harder it is for them to deal with humiliating experiences. And he had a hard time with this as well. And he said, those who have lost a true sense of humility, that constant realization of the relationship between each individual and God, have also lost the ability to look upon their burdens in this way. They see instead only the burden, the difficulties, the humiliation, and they become depressed. They pity themselves. They think they're worthless. And he says that ultimately what they're trying to explain, these people searching for an answer other than God, is the radical change in themselves that has brought them to the point of interior crisis in a vocation, for instance, that they once embraced with so much joy and enthusiasm. How can all of this happen so suddenly, he asks, seemingly in such a short period of time? And he says the answer lies in a loss of the virtue of humility. So he talks a lot more about humility in this, really, like, just speaks to you as an individual and your own struggles with that. He says, no matter how badly the humble man fails, he will reckon his accounts with God and start over again, for his humility tells him of his total dependence on God. I'll just say one more thing about humility, but there's, like, an awful lot in here about it that is worthwhile reading. But he says that what humility means is learning to accept disappointments and even defeat as God sent, learning to persevere and carry on with peace of heart and confidence in God, secure in the knowledge that something worthwhile is being accomplished precisely because God's will is at work in our life, and we are doing our best to accept and follow it. So anyway, now he's in Krasnoyarsk, and he said that he got there, he had to sign in with the police again, and someone that was working in the police department actually asked him if first his nationality, and he said, I'm Polish, and then he said, are you Catholic? And Father Ciszek was hesitant, but something felt like he could answer accurate, like he could be honest about it, and he said yes. And the man said that he's like, well, I'm part of a parish and we actually just lost our priest. The priest just died and they were looking for a new priest. And at first Father Ciszek thought it was a trap arranged by the KGB, but he kept talking to the man and he agreed to go visit the church. And sure enough, he basically inherited a parish this way, and he all of a sudden, like, had a following, and he just couldn't believe, like, he was so almost depressed to be leaving Norilsk, and here he was, and he had his own community, and this time not in a little hut where he was sleeping and performing mass, but in an actual church. Unfortunately, Father Ciszek's stay was short-lived. there. The secret police showed up one morning at 1 a.m., told him he had 48 hours to pack up and leave town. And he had to leave his parishioners once again. This time he was sent to Abakan in Russia, and he started working as a mechanic in a car garage so that he could make some money so he could rent a place. But he found a way, and he was able to have a following again, was able to minister to people, perform mass, hear confessions, and be an active priest in this part of Russia as well. And it's amazing. So in any event, after almost 24 long years in Russia, he came home. He came back to the United States in 1963. He made it home. And people often ask him, he said, everyone asked him, obviously, when he first got back to the United States, how he survived. And he says that, "I survived on the basis of the faith others may find too simple and naive." He survived on faith, and he says that it might just be too simplistic for some to understand, but that's the truth. You know, he apologizes in this book if his answer is not what people expected. He says that every moment of our life has a purpose, that every action of ours, no matter how dull or routine or trivial it may seem in itself, has a dignity and a worth beyond human understanding. For what can ultimately trouble the soul that accepts every moment of every day as a gift from the hands of God and strives always to do his will? He says that if God is for us, who can stand against us? It's a beautiful story, again, whether you're Catholic or Christian or not. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion today. If you have any questions, comments, please feel free to leave them. Also subscribe and let me know if there are any books that you would like me to review. So thanks so much for listening. Until next time. Father Ciszek talks about the struggle every day of having faith and keeping faith. And he speaks to us in this book. He speaks to people in general in this book. And he says that he understands that it's difficult. It's difficult to be able to accept the will of God when you don't understand it. Especially when everyday situations and circumstances demand our attention. It's hard when you're in the middle of your own personal trial, tribulation, you're in pain, to see through that, to see past that. And he says that it's through daily prayer. That's the only way to do it. It's like daily acceptance, daily prayer. And he said that through the anguish of Lubyanka, the prison he was in, through the sufferings and adversities of the prison camps, my inner struggle of soul never ceased. His own inner struggle of soul never ceased. He said, no matter how close to God the soul felt, how blessed it was by an awareness of his presence on occasion, the realities of life were always at hand, always demanding recognition. So he talks about it just being a choice every day, to have faith, but that only happens with daily prayer as well. He said that that's what he had to do.